Hey guys, it's Tim coming at you with a brand new episode of The Spotlight, the show where I pose an interesting question or just a general interesting idea and then have you guys take it from there in the comments. So with the recent hype and buzz surrounding the trailers for the new Marvel Netflix series, and looking at what's being done on Netflix compared to what's being done on television and on film, the thing I had to ask myself was, is Netflix the future for comic books? So let's look at this comparing it to film, television, and even to the comic books themselves. And probably the biggest comparison between Netflix and film that I can think of would basically be comparing time to budget. Essentially story versus spectacle. That and films allow you to reach a much wider audience. But in terms of storytelling, comic books are an ongoing medium, so having a storytelling medium that allows you to tell ongoing stories continuously season to season, as well as over a longer period of time for each story, would probably aid comic books a lot better than the more condensed stories of films. Plus, with the success of shows like The Wire or Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones, television as a medium is definitely pushing further and further ahead in terms of being the greater storytelling medium compared to film. But why Netflix over traditional television? Well, I'd say that is more for a twofold reason. The first of which being the lack of restriction. While there are channels like AMC and HBO on television that will allow for grittier storytelling than network or basic cable shows like Arrow or The Flash, the problem with them is trying to maintain your audience with them due to the amount of people who just don't have cable at all nowadays and the amount of people who don't want to pay for the additional channel on their cable packages due to the different deals that cable companies have. And network shows, despite having greater exposure, are restricted by the fact that they can't get away with as much. And you also have to consider the fact that since Netflix really doesn't have any set niche that it appeals to due to the wide library that it possessed even before it started doing original content, you have a lot more freedom on Netflix to show what you want to show than you do on any normal television network. And the other part of the reason is due to the prevalence of the binge-watching culture. Since even with normal television shows, usually nowadays people will stave off watching them live in favor of watching it all at once in one large chunk. So releasing it all at once on Netflix allows people to set their own pace for how they want to watch the show, either in one large chunk or over time, without having to wait for specific air dates. And that's just for live action shows. Because you've probably noticed with recent comic book animation, or even recent action animation, that there's really more of a skew towards comedy these days with it, or appealing more towards a younger audience. Really the only half-hour action show that's still on television these days is Star Wars Rebels. At least ones that are straight action shows without having more of a skew towards comedy or towards appealing to children more. Even the recent trailer for Justice League Action showed that while it does have the action that's in the title, it's still 15 minutes long and it seems to have more of a comedy skew like Batman the Brave and the Bold, and even to me seems like it's just a more polished version of Ultimate Spider-Man. And with the recent positive reaction of half-hour action shows on Netflix like Voltron Legendary Defender, this can definitely be a new open medium for releasing this kind of show, like the comic book shows that a lot of us grew up with, Justice League Unlimited, Teen Titans, or even more recent stuff like Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes. And finally, when comparing Netflix to the comics, you have the one really big thing that you can't ignore. Despite the prevalency of comic book characters and comic book content these days on television and film, comic books themselves still remain a niche medium. I mean, for evidence of this, just look at the recent article that announced that there was going to be a Captain America statue put into Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Outside of the fact that they used his movie costume instead of any classic comic book costume for him, despite the statue supposedly celebrating the 75 years of Captain America since 1941, the quote on it is, "I'm just a kid from Brooklyn," and it's in Brooklyn, despite the fact that in the comics, Captain America isn't from Brooklyn. That's a thing that was made up by the MCU. And while having the statue as great as a symbolic thing, it really goes far and away to show you the prevalency of movies over comic books, where it took only 5 years for Captain America to become popular enough to get a statue in New York City than he was able to in the 70 years he was in comics before those films came out. And since comic books themselves, while they probably won't go away anytime soon, they definitely aren't doing as well nowadays than they had been in previous years. So if worse comes to worse with the medium, Netflix might be the best place to move forward with continuing the stories of these characters and keeping them in the public eye. But that's just what I think on the subject, so what do you guys think? Do you think that Netflix can be the future for comic books, either just as adaptations or even in general? Well, let us know in the comments. If you've liked what you've seen here, feel free to subscribe if you haven't yet. We have a Patreon account you can donate to if you feel so inclined. And until next time, this has been Tim from the Hybrid Network, signing out.